So hey, welcome people. Today I'll be giving a workshop about how you can use TypeScript and GraphQL together with a React application. So while I'm doing this, you always have to ask yourself the question, who is this for? So this like 45, 50 minutes workshop will help you determining how to use TypeScript and GraphQL together. And I think for this it's important for you to understand what GraphQL is, what TypeScript is, and how you can create cool applications using both technologies. So a little bit about myself first. So my name is Roy. You can find me on Twitter using @GetHackTeam. And currently I work for Vanderbron, which is a renewable energy company in the Netherlands. Before I worked for tons of companies such as the City of Amsterdam, where we've built great open source projects for both the city, the people working at the city, and even for people living in the city, which even might be you. And prior, I had some startups, and I also worked for React GraphQL Academy, where we used to teach React and GraphQL and how to use these technologies together. And next to my current job, I also written tons of books and also spoke at some workshops and conferences before. An example last year during frontendlove about how you can use GraphQL without having a GraphQL server. And this will basically be sort of the input for this workshop as well. Because today I'm going to show you how you can use a basic GraphQL server built with TypeScript and use it in a front-end React application that uses TypeScript as well. And if you want to know more about GraphQL after this workshop, make sure to get my book, Full Stack GraphQL, in which you can find real-world examples from beginning to end about how to build a full stack GraphQL applications. So this workshop is giving you a real introduction, but for the real in-depth complex knowledge, make sure to get this book. So what do you already know about TypeScript? So TypeScript is nothing really more than a variation of JavaScript. So it's basically what we call a typed superset of JavaScript. So which means it has all the features of JavaScript, but it has been extended or enhanced with more features. So basically, in the situation of TypeScript, it means that it can do JavaScript a bit more, because TypeScript actually compiles the plain JavaScript. So if you would be using a TypeScript application in your local development environment, when it runs in the browser, it's just plain JavaScript, because that's how TypeScript works. It compiles TypeScript to some sort of JavaScript that your browser can actually understand. This is something you're going to see in the exercises later on, but it can help you compiling to all sorts of JavaScript. So an example, ES5 or ES6 or ES 2020, what we call today, like modern JavaScript. And it's up to you to decide which kind of compilation you want. And for this, it's also important to understand that it has the latest ECMAScript features. So it doesn't matter what type of JavaScript you want to use, but you can always use the latest one if you prefer. So in TypeScript, you're versioning, just like JavaScript that's versioning. It doesn't correlate directly to ECMAScript, but the latest version of TypeScript usually has all the latest version of ECMAScript as well. And the cool thing here is, what else has types besides TypeScript? It's GraphQL. As you probably could have mentioned from the title of this workshop, it's going to show you how to use GraphQL together with TypeScript. And for this, it's important to understand that GraphQL actually also has types. And if you aren't familiar with GraphQL, then please listen now, because it's important to understand what GraphQL is before you're actually going to be using it together with TypeScript. So GraphQL is what you call a query language for API. And maybe query language is a bit of an underestimation today, because GraphQL has become an entire ecosystem of tools and programming languages using these tools. But for now, we can basically understand GraphQL as a query language for APIs. And its main USP is that it offers a single endpoint that has multiple resources. So from one single endpoint, you can retrieve multiple data sources or resources, whatever you like to call them. But everything you do with a GraphQL server is based on one single endpoint. And as you might have guessed, it's based on a type system. So whatever you'll be doing with GraphQL, it should be supported by the internal GraphQL type system, which isn't too different from the TypeScript type system. So this is also important to know if you start working with these technologies together. Both have a type system, and they aren't that different from each other. So if you look on the left side, you can see a TypeScript a TypeScript type system example, and on the right side, one from GraphQL. So you can see they both have the same fields. The way to define a product is almost exactly the same, and product is a type in this situation. And product in both situations has multiple fields, 6 to be precise. And these 6 are either like basic types, like a number or a string, or an integer or a string in GraphQL, or they have like custom types, which is either category or review for both scenarios. And as you can see, it both looks very similar with some distinctions. So if you look on the left side, you can see required fields in TypeScript because they don't have a question mark. And on the right side, you can see actually everything is optional, which is different from TypeScript, where everything is required unless you specify it's optional. In GraphQL, every field is optional unless you specify they're required by using the exclamation mark. So you can see some subtle differences, but the differences aren't that big, and they're quite overseeable. And they both have the basic Scala types, which you just went over, and they can relate to other types as well, so custom types or custom Scala types, as we call them in GraphQL. And the optional and required flags are different in TypeScript, the other way around. But luckily, there are libraries to help you solve these sort of situations where you might get confused whether something is optional or required. So how can you combine TypeScript and GraphQL? So if you look at a server-side perspective, then type GraphQL should be the way to go, because type GraphQL is a library to build GraphQL servers, and in there you build GraphQL servers sort of code first. So you won't have a schema at your very prior top, but you would have code definitions which create a schema. But for now, we're gonna use the other way around. So we're actually going to work from a schema and going to create GraphQL applications with React from that schema. So this is basically the other way around, and you can do it with a package called GraphQL Code Generator. And actually, it's more than just a single package. It's an entire CLI that supports multiple packages in the form of plugins. But you're going to see that in the demo for the exercises. So GraphQL Code Generator basically is a CLI tool that generates TypeScript types from a GraphQL schema. So this is example important to understand. You have a GraphQL schema, and you're going to base TypeScript types based on the GraphQL schema. And the schema is used to generate the types. So this is also important. Without a schema, you wouldn't be able to generate the types from it. And if you want to learn more, there's tons of links, but I presume we just go to the exercises and see what to do. So I've built a basic GraphQL server in here. So you can see I have this example, JS world TS GraphQL, which is the repository that you can find in the description for this workshop. And in here, you can see we have a server and we have an application. So we're going to focus on the server part first. So let me enhance my screen a bit so I'm sure that you can see everything. In here, you can see we've got the server directory. In there, there's a source, and in there is a TypeScript file, which is called index.ts. And this is everything we need for the Express GraphQL server, because that's what we'll be using. We'll be using Express and GraphQL together to create a GraphQL server. And in here, you can see I've built a basic schema, and I have some resolvers, and I'm using Express to generate the GraphQL server. And the main thing to understand about GraphQL, it has a schema, which is called type definitions, and we have resolvers, and together you can create GraphQL servers out of it. So let me try and run the server. I already installed all the libraries and packages that we need. I'm just going to do yarn start. It's going to start my server, and hopefully all goes well. Yes, so I've got a local version of my server. So let's try and use it. Oh, I forgot to couple the H. This is our GraphQL server. It's nothing that fancy. If you've seen this for the first time, this is called the GraphQL Explorer. So in here, you can explore a GraphQL server and see all the elements that it consists of. So an example, we can see we have a query. Query are like your basic GET request for a REST server. You can see we have a query, and we have one query called list. And list, you can get the field list items, which has its fields on its own. So on the left side of this Explorer, you can see actually how to write a query. So in here, I've written a very basic query, which is query to get list. It is a named query as well. So query get list. But this is our query, and it just retrieves a lot of items from our server, and for every item it will also get the name. So you can add more stuff like here, like maybe the ID. Let's get the ID in there. You see, just like this, like really straightforward. You go in your query, you define what data should be retrieved. It's a bit like SQL, but then we're using the GraphQL query language. And we can also have relations, because if we look at our list item type, it also has relationship with category. And category also has name. So now we can even have nested relationships. So this is how GraphQL works in a very nutshell. And then, of course, we also have a React application that we want to use with this one. So let me start the React application as well. It's going to do a yarn start, and it will start the React application that I've built here. So I've got a folder called app, and in the folder called app, there's a source. And in source, you can find basically this code. And what it will do, this code is using GraphQL request. Let me see, which is here. Oh, wait, it's here. So it's used the GraphQL request library to use our local GraphQL server and then send this query to it. So this query is the same one that we've been using here. So it's the same query that you saw before. You can also prettify this, and you can see it omits the query because it's going to assume it's a query unless you specify it to be otherwise. If you prettify this, you just get the query word omitted. And this React application is doing nothing more than just getting the information from our GraphQL server and display it here. And it's doing so using the GraphQL request library, which is the library that is the most low-key library that you could use for this example. And as you can see here, I'm using JSX, which is JavaScript, is not TypeScript. And so let me try and revert this. Let's make a TypeScript file out of it to demonstrate why we should be using TypeScript actually. So I think we have to restart our React application because we now need to find the TSX file in there. So start the development server. Let's see what happens. We've done nothing except just renaming the app.jsx file to a tsx file. And as you can see, it just works, but we haven't set any types in here. So if we would look at the data type, you can see it's got like a never, which is something you want to omit. And also for here, it also knows what the types are, because in here it thinks data is any. So the thing is, we need to define types for our data. And if you won't be using something like GraphQL code generator, you would have to define these types yourself. So in example, we should know that data is whatever is returned by the GraphQL server. So it should have these fields, right? So we have data, we have list, we have name. So let me try and create the type for this. So maybe we can add something here. Let's close this one. And this is something you can do at home as well. Try and create the type for this return field. Maybe we can call this GraphQL return field. This is actually a thing I don't like, because what are we getting? We're getting the list. So let's just make the type called list. I always do it the other way around. Do we need to use the is mark in there? We probably do. So we have a field called list. It has ID, which if we look at our GraphQL server is an integer. So that should be a number. And then we also have another field called name. Let's get rid of this field for now. Just make it too confusing. What's happening here? Okay, so now we have ID and name, which is our string and a number. So let's try and do that in here. We have name. Let's make that a string. Format this a bit. Let me go and get rid of this one for now, because we're not really using it. And make it ID. Okay, now we still have a GraphQL thinking, or React application thinking the data type of any is any, something we don't want, because actually we now know it is an array of lists, right? And actually it's a little more different. It is a data which is an array of lists. Or actually, make it even more complicated, data has a field called list, which is an array of the type list. Try and format this document a bit. We need some here. It's not going well, actually. So let me feel. So data field is this of this type. So it's data, which is another object which has list, which then has the list array. A property list does exist on type list, so then maybe it is the other way around. As you can see, it's a lot of hassle because now we're trying to get these types right, but it's actually something you don't want right because list is not assignable. Why is this? Because set data also needs to have a definition. So we're going to use the set data function, which is coming from the use state. So we also need a generic to tell use state whatever it can expect here. So this will be an array of lists. So now we've got a fix. We've created a field for list. We created one here. So this is cool, right? We just use a GraphQL server. We're going to use the schema to find what kind of types we have, and then we're going to incorporate these in our React application. And in here, we probably have to see, oh, name knows is already a string. That's cool, right? Because it's going to map over data, and data has the shape of list, and then it's going to know what the data is. So in here, our GraphQL application, we're having some errors now that are resolved. And this works perfectly fine, right? Until you maybe start making some changes at your GraphQL server. So this is our GraphQL server. So this is our schema. And you're going to see we have an ID, a name, a category, and category is its own type, which is also called category. But what an example if we would have a category name as a field. Because yeah, category is just a relationship we have and it's just a string. So why not have a category name in there? And then we can use something cool like the deprecated field to let people know this one is deprecated, which is actually quite a cool way of doing so. I'll refresh this a bit. It's like it's quite slow. So now you can see we have category. We've got some error here. Let's see what it is. Channel closed. It doesn't look good. Maybe try restart our server. See what's actually going on. Error address already in use. Yeah, which is quite annoying. So this sometimes happens. So we didn't close our GraphQL server properly, so it's going to assume the address 8080 is already in use. Probably would have to kill it somehow. Let me try and find this command. It's something I actually always do. So quite useful if you're SSH, close port, close an SSH tunnel. And for this, we're just going to use Stack Overflow to get some basic information to kill port in use. Do it even a bit more. So that's actually how the cool developers do it, right? Like closing and open ports using Stack Overflow commands. It's quite nice, but you also have to find the thing in use. So node, close port, use. Page port already in use. I think we can just remove this part from the recording because we don't really need it. Okay, so let me go there and use 8080 here. Close this one. Should be able to restart our server again. Yes. Yeah, so let me catch up again. So we made some changes here. So we added category name, which is a string, and we also saw categories deprecated. So let's try and do this request again. So refresh this one. We see we now have a category name in there, which is a string. And you see the relationship we previously had, we deprecated it. So this one is no longer supported, which actually means you can still use it, but it doesn't show up in the auto suggestion anymore. It still works, so this is really cool if you have older applications running the server. But actually, preferred way of using is category name, which we also then should, of course, add to our data. So we can just do this, make this category name. Cool. Now we should be able to do this thing. But the main problem you have here in your React application, you don't really know that there's an extra field. So if we start using category name here, this actually wouldn't be correct anymore because this still worked, but we're not actually checking type. But for example, if we would also want to display category name here. Category name comes from this one. But actually we got an error here, right? Because category name does not exist. So every time you need to add something here, you need to define it right here. Now it works again because now your types are complete. Still, that isn't really super future-proof because maybe in your React server, maybe we're going to deprecate category name again, and we're actually going to do this one where category has more information like IDs. We have category here, which also has ID, which is integer. And let's say maybe not this one is deprecated, we're actually going to deprecate this one because we're still struggling a bit with our application. We don't really know what kind of data we want to use. We're still working on the data model. So category name this no longer works because, yeah, of course it's deprecated. And we're going to go with category again. And we also have category with an ID, which is running like this, right? In a React application, boom, everything breaks because your React application isn't up to speed with what's happening in your TypeScript GraphQL server. So in here again, we need to change the types a bit. So we have category. What does category look like? I don't know. Maybe let's go to my server. So I refresh this thing and see what category looks like. Because category is a type. There it is. It's here. It's a type with an ID and a name. So we have ID, which is probably like a number. And then we have name, which is also a string. Okay, cool. And then probably we need to change it here as well because this no longer exists. So maybe we have category and we have name. Maybe we can rename to category name. This probably works, right? But it looks quite interesting. Can return a non-nullable field, category name. Somehow we still have it somewhere. Of course, we have category here, and then we have name. Oh, this is annoying. I need to change a lot of data just to display the category name right here. So this is one of the things you could do with GraphQL and TypeScript together, but it's going to take you a very, very, very long time. So that's why there's the library GraphQL Code Generator, which we'll be using to auto-generate these types from our GraphQL server. So let me try and find GraphQL Code Generator, the website, and then let's see how to actually use this. So we have GraphQL Code Generator, which is this library. It's a quite cool library, and actually what it does, it takes your GraphQL schema, your GraphQL operations, if you have any, it takes some configuration, and it's going to generate TypeScript types for you. So how would you use this library? So let me go to the installation part. So in your GraphQL frontend application, you're going to add GraphQL, which we already did because we're using GraphQL request, and you're going to add GraphQL Code Generator CLI. So let me try and run this command. I probably have done this beforehand, so it should be quite fast. It's going to install GraphQL Code Generator CLI for you. that's installed. And then we need to actually start the CLI. So that's where we go down. And this is the cool part. So because it's a CLI, it also has a command to help you set up GraphQL code generator. So we're going to use the CLI. Zoom into this part. So the first question we get, what are we actually building? So are we building a backend application, an application built with Angular, with React, Stencil, or any other framework? So the cool thing about the GraphQL code generator is that it works with multiple types of libraries and for multiple types of applications. So in here, we're going to build an application with React. That's what we're already doing. So where's your schema? Our schema, of course, is at the place where our GraphQL server is running. So let me try and copy that one. Here, HTTP localhost 8080/GraphQL. So this is a local GraphQL server URL, and that's where our schema already is. So where are your operation fragments? We didn't really put any operation fragments in here yet. So we're just gonna, for now, I'm just gonna assume this is okay. I'm gonna comment it out later on. So we're using TypeScript operations, and React Apollo. So React Apollo is something we aren't using yet. So let's delete that one from the mix because we're just using TypeScript and TypeScript operations. Where to write the output. So this is also a thing that it does. So it's going to generate the output for you in a file. And this file is called generated/graphql.js. And this is where all the files that you can use as your type definitions are actually living. So where do you want to generate an introspection file? Yeah, sure, why not? Let's create one. Name a config file. Just go for the default. And what script should run it? So it will ultimately create a start script for us, which we can call generate. So this will start a generation of the TypeScript types from the server. So config file created. Let's run npm install. So actually we're going to use yarn because that's the library. That's the package runner I'm using. So that's cool. So if we would now go to the code and YAML file, so this is something that's created for us. Let's comment this one out because we didn't really put our document somewhere yet. And let's actually try and generate it, right? So run yarn generate. Let's see what happens. It's running. It's parsing configuration and generating output. So you see it's created a new file called generated.js. And in here you can find all the types that have been created for this GraphQL server. So it has a deprecated fields, it has a list item, a query, and category. So in our application, we actually can get rid of this list file, right? Because this list, it correctly derivates to what we call list item here. So this ID, the name, category, category name. So let's get rid of this one and use list item instead. I'm going to import it from a generated file, and this one can be deleted. So we already saved a lot of files. And then in here, we can do the same, of course. So return this list item, and just do it like this. And then over here, you can see all the information is still there. And in here, you can actually see something quite cool. So GraphQL is already telling us, based on the TypeScript definition that we have, that this one is deprecated as well. So GraphQL code generator is doing more for us than just generating types, and also giving us in IDE examples of things that you could be changing. So it's going to say us, don't use category, it's being deprecated, it's no longer supported, just get rid of it. So this is a cool item, right? But what if we're going to start renaming things in here? So we have a name, we have a list, but what if we want to rename category, which has some fields in there? Maybe we want to add a new field or rename a field. So maybe category will become category name again. Prettify. We go to the server. Let me see what we're returning for this. So we have category name. Let's make sure we're returning something here as well. I think we maybe need to start a server again, just to be sure. So port already in use problem again. Let's see what are we using here. Oh, we actually got 2 ports running. Yeah, so killing the process going on and then restart the server again. We should see this working. So we have category name. And our React application, everything works fine. So let's go to a React application. We see we now already have the types from our generated code generator file, and we're actually using these things to render our application in here. And this one's actually deprecated, so we can again just get rid of it. Use category name like this, which should be all fine. And I think if we refactor this as well. So now we have the ideal situation again, right? So we have some auto-generated types. We have some types defined here. We do some queries. But the cool thing from GraphQL Code Generator is that you can also use it with Apollo Client. And Apollo Client is like a really extensive library to help you doing stuff with React and Apollo. But for this, we're going to actually install React Apollo to use it in our application. At first, we need to, of course, make sure that the GraphQL Code Generator is ready for it. So we're going to add the right plugin. And we're also going to install Apollo Client. So with this, we're going to do yarn add apollo/client. And for this, I'm actually going to go to the documentation of Apollo Client and seeing how to do the installation, just to be sure. For this, we're using npm install, Apollo Client, and GraphQL, which is exactly what I'm doing here. And then the first thing we need to do is create a client. So in our React applications, we're going to use Apollo Client to sort of wrap this application with an Apollo Client, which is something we usually do from the index file. So here we're going to import Apollo Client, the in-memory cache. I'm going to put them right there. For the URL for the server, we're going to use the local GraphQL server we have running. Which is this one. So now we've got the client created, and then we need to use something with React. So we're going to use Apollo Provider. And Apollo Provider is a wrapper that wraps your application with the configuration of your GraphQL server. So Apollo Provider is something we also get from here. This is sort of the rudimentary setup. I'm going to start the server again. Not that much will happen, except from everywhere within this component tree, we should be able to use Apollo Provider and its client to actually get information from the GraphQL server. Wait till this page reloads. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about Apollo Provider. So in here, we're going to use the use query hook from Apollo. This is still working. We're going to use the use query hook from Apollo to actually get our information from the GraphQL server. So let me just try and copy this one. So we're going to use the use query hook, and we're going to replace the implementation with GraphQL request, because this is a very minor implementation, but it's something we want to do with Apollo instead. So we're going to use import use query and GQL, because GQL is something we already used to use the GraphQL query language. And the use query hook is something we'll be using here. And for the use query hook, we're actually going to be inputting our query. So up. And use query hook would also return us information for our server. Let me go here. And it's going to return constant loading, data, and error. So, like this. We no longer have to do the data fetching, because that's something that's being done by the use query hook. So we can get rid of this one. And in here, we're just going to map over the data, but it's still going to think it's implicitly any type. Well, I think if we would go here, it's failed to compile because it has the any type, right? So we could just do this. Oh. Fix it. Data is also something it doesn't know if it's actually that's length. And because here it isn't doing anything yet, because it still needs to send our query using the use query hook to the GraphQL server. So let me see what is going on. So actually this is fetching data. So let me see what data looks like. Console.log. Check this. Let's see what's going on. Is it actually fetching something? It's fetching an object. It's data and data list. Okay, so we need to add an extra layer. So we can actually do this one. Const list is actually list is data.data. And then here we can actually replace everything with lists. So list over and list again. And then this should probably work. Data is undefined. Do it like this. Yeah. So here we have a GraphQL data again, and this time fetched by the use query hook from a GraphQL Apollo or Apollo client. And this list item is something we could still use because use query should get our type definitions, because now we have them defined as any, but we don't want that. We actually want to use this one here. Let me see if that's correct. A bit more, so we need to define it like this. And then this should be an array. I think this is sort of our type, or is it like this? Let me try and find out. You see list does not exist on type, which is list. So what's the type of the thing that use query returns? So it's not list but a list item, but it's actually returning us data. This, and this should be wrapped in brackets. But this is part of our return, but now we still get an error. List does not exist on type. List of data is undefined. So let me check out what it actually returns. So you can see type definitions, they're already looking quite interesting here. Does exist. So we have list and we have data and use query. Let's see what it actually returns. So as you can see, it's already quite complicated, but I'm sure if you try and figure it out at home, you probably get there. So let me just skip this for now. I'm just going to assume it returns any here, because it's not the main focus of what I want to do. I think you're pretty capable of at home of adding the type definitions, which we will add as an exercise to the workshops. You can try and figure it out, and you can also find the concrete correct examples. The thing what you're actually going to do is using GraphQL code generator together with this to create the type definitions at once. So let me find TypeScript React Apollo. And we're not going to use with component, we're going to use hooks. So actually, we're going to add this one in our YAML file. In the plugins, just going to extend the plugins. Yeah, so it generates config, add the plugins at the bottom. Format this document. Let me see here, what levels config at. It's at the same level as plugins, so we're going to add it right here. The nice thing with YAML files, like the order and the hierarchy of this is really important. Otherwise it won't stick. But this is our configuration, and we should also define a document. So in the document, you can add the GraphQL generation. So in this, we can maybe call it query.graphql. Oh, not the slash, a dot. Yes, and then here we can actually add the query that we're using here. Format it a bit. Okay. So now if we will be running the GraphQL code generator again, it should generate an Apollo component based on this query and based on our GraphQL server. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to run yarn generate again. Yes, so it's created a configuration file. And here at the bottom, you can see we have a use query hook, which actually has types now. So there's a query type. And up here, you can see the document we have, an unnamed query, which is also dangerous. So query get list. Try and name it. So our configuration will look better. We can generate it again. Okay. We try and run our application, and then we should be able to import the get list query from here, which would then also be our type for this one. And will also help us get rid of a lot of stuff that we have here. But instead, we will be using the use get list query, which is a hook. You can import here. So use get list query. We don't need to define any types. Just going to need to import this one here. And it also doesn't take the query because the query is already known. And let me see why this fails. Let me just out. So we really need to understand what kind of data we're getting. The thing is, we can delete a lot of stuff here. And we're just going to log and see what data looks like. In the application, you can see our GraphQL request is being made. You can see the list is being returned by Apollo client. And in our console, let me just clear this out and refresh it. You can see we have data, which is a list. Okay, so this is actually return of data. So we can do this const list is data, or data could also be empty. So let me do this console log list. Looks like, so list is an array of list, which is already getting quite interesting. Sure that we actually have a list before we're trying to iterate over it. And here you can see we have all our information again. The cool thing is you can see here, we don't have any type declarations in here anymore. We can delete the any, and it's going to get the information from this GraphQL server. And still, if we still want, we could type them here. Just item there, which of course imported from here. And you see we can still have the type definition. So category name is deprecated, so apparently we're not using it anymore. If you get rid of this, then you can see the type should be correct. Or there's even more to the type, but this is something you can figure out. So I think the cool thing about this is that you can actually use the generated components instead of the components that are being given to you automatically. And I think this concludes most of the workshop. You can actually try and play around with using these technologies together, using the workshop exercises, and we'll also have a bonus exercise for people that want to get more into detail. So I think that's it from our side. If you want to know more about these technologies, make sure to look at the GraphQL code generator website because most of the instructions are also there. And also, if you have any questions about the workshop, make sure to reach out to me on Twitter using my handle at GetHackTeam and ask your questions there. So thank you a lot. And yeah, hopefully I'll be seeing you again at some conference soon. Hi, my name is Roy, and thank you for joining me at JS World. And for this, I also like to share one programming tip that I have for a younger self of me. So one thing you actually need to do is make sure read documentation, look at tutorials online, and also make sure to be open to feedback from everyone. Because in the end, you cannot learn something new on yourself. It's really good to get like examples from other people, follow people on Twitter, look at tutorials, read a lot of documentation, and in the end, try not to be overwhelmed with all the information that's available, because there's a lot of information available. It's just up to you to find the correct way of segmenting things that are wrong from things that are good. But in general, there are a lot of accounts you can follow on Twitter that can actually help you with finding these things out. So that would be my future, the tip to my past self. And I think most of all, have fun in programming, because you cannot learn something in a day. So you should be open to taking a longer time to learn things. Thank you.